I wanted to take a moment to talk about grief, especially during the coronavirus. People dying. It's a very different death. It's a very different experience for loved ones who are left behind. So can you share some insight on that?
Sure. Unfortunately, with the situation of the coronavirus, because it was so contagious that people could not be with their loved ones at the time of dying and at the time of death. And that really puts a big strain on grievers, because sometimes it really keeps them stuck in not being able to go further in the grief process because they are feeling so guilty that they could not be with their loved one. And in addition, they couldn't have the services that they wanted. Either they couldn't have any service, funeral service, or they had to have a limited amount of people. There were many instances where there was only one person allowed to go. And that really makes the grieving process difficult, because part of one of the tools in grieving is to grieve with others and have others support you in your grief. So if people get stuck in those two instances of not being with their loved one and then the services, it really puts them at a risk of having more complicated grief reactions, because they're not moving through, and it could last a long time.
And tell me what is different in the dying process with COVID. Can you explain to listeners what's different, what's happening in the hospitals?
The one amazing thing, and this is what I tell families too, is that during the illness and the dying processes, the nurses and doctors and aides and all the personnel in the hospital were so aware that these people were alone, and they were so much more compassionate. I've heard of story after story of nurses holding the hand of people who are dying. In many of the hospitals, I also work for a local hospital, and in one of the hospitals, they were doing iPad visits with the family so that they could have one last session. But these are really, really very emotional times. They bring a lot of guilt to the families. And I tell the families that we understand that horror of not being with your loved one, but it wasn't something that you chose. This was something that, because of the situation, you were not able to do. So I just suggest to clients to have two feelings at the same time: a wish that they could have been there. In fact, you work with that a little bit, Mary, don't you?
I do. So with hypnosis, the people I've been dealing with that have lost loved ones to the virus, one of the things in hypnosis, we can actually create that space of the last goodbye. And that's been very healing for people to go through in the mind of the imagination of hypnosis, to bring that person in front of you and to be able to say that goodbye in the last words. Because a lot of people went into the hospital not realizing they would get worse. People seemed like they were getting better, and then all of a sudden they would get a call from the medical staff that they had passed or that they were going to pass. So these are unprecedented times, and I have lost loved ones in hospitals, but I was lucky enough to be with them. And I can only imagine when that's what you want to be, is be with them, and you can't. And that's where some of the hypnosis is helping, but that's where really I think people need to seek the help during this time, and someone like Lenore who can help with the counseling and maybe put things in a different perspective.
Well, we have to, because there's going to be so many unanswered questions. What did they do the moment they died? Who was with them? Some of these things they'll never be able to find out. But we still have to go through the process. So there's, we in my counseling sessions, we work on accepting the fact that this is the way it is, not the way that you would have wanted it, but that this is the way it is, and how do we move forward from there? How do we just say, I want to get back into how I love them and the other memories of our loved ones in order to move forward.
Lenore, how can people grieve through the process maybe a little easier? What tips do you have for them?
In my counseling sessions, I work with people. Sometimes we have to accept the fact that things were not the way that we wanted. Even before COVID, there were people who could not be with their loved ones, at the time of death.
Right.
And many people get very stuck in that. And we talk about how, it would be a wish to do that, but we have to work on acceptance of the fact either sometimes things are just the way they're supposed to be, and that's sometimes where spirituality comes in, that we have to just say things happen for a reason.
Right.
Or we just have to talk about it so that we begin to understand that I need to accept the way that it was so that I can get back into this next phase of the grief, which is learning to remember them and love them for the rest, for the other times of their life. They're not just their dying.
Right.
And of course, in all grief, right after a loss, we really focus more on the dying.
Right.
And losing them,
Right.
rather than on what we did have.
Right.
And that takes time.
Right.
And that takes work. Grief is very active.
Right.
And we say that you need to talk about it with people. That's why counseling is good, bereavement group, journaling,
Right.
just to get the feelings out. They need to be processed.